Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is from chapter 288. Chapter 288. The French evacuation began on the night between the 6th and 7th of October. Kitchens and sheds were dismantled, carts loaded, and troops and baggage trains started. At 7 in the morning, a French convoy in marching trim, wearing shakos and carrying muskets, knapsacks, and enormous sacks, stood in front of the sheds, and animated French talk mingled with curses sounding along the lines. In the shed, everyone was ready, dressed, belted, shod, and only awaited the order to start. The sick soldier, Sokolov, pale and thin, with dark shadows round his eyes, alone sat in his place barefoot and not dressed. His eyes, prominent from the emaciation of his face, gazed inquiringly at his comrades, who were paying no attention to him, and he moaned regularly and quietly. It was evidently not so much his suffering that caused him to moan, he had dysentery, as his fear and grief at being left alone. Pierre, girt with a rope around his waist and wearing shoes Karatsiev had made for him from some leather a French soldier had torn off a tea-chest and brought to have his boots mended with, went up to the sick man and squatted down beside him. "You know, Sokolov, they're not all going away. They have a hospital there. You may be better off than we others," said Pierre. "Oh, Lord. Oh, it will be the death of me. Oh, Lord," moaned the man in a louder voice. I'll go and ask them again directly," said Pierre, rising and going to the door of the shed. Just as Pierre reached the door, the corporal, who had offered him a pipe the day before, came up to sit with two soldiers. The corporal and soldiers were in marching kit with knapsacks and shakos that had metal straps, and these changed their familiar faces. The corporal came, according to orders, to shut the door. The prisoners had to be counted before being let out. "Corporal, what will they do with the sick man?" Pierre began. But even as he spoke, he began to doubt whether this was the corporal he knew or a stranger. So unlike himself did the corporal seem at that particular moment. Moreover, just as Pierre was speaking, a sharp rattle of drums was suddenly heard from both sides. The corporal frowned at Pierre's words, and uttering some meaningless oaths, slammed the door. The shed became semi-dark, and the sharp rattle of the drums on two sides drowned the sick man's groans. "There it is, it again," said Pierre to himself, and an involuntary shudder ran down his spine. In the corporal's changed face, in the sound of his voice, in the stirring and deafening noise of the drums, he recognized that mysterious callous force which compelled men against their will to kill their fellow men. That force the effect of which he had witnessed during the executions. To fear or to try to escape that force, to address entreaties or exhortations to those who served as its tools, was useless. Pierre knew this now. One had to wait and endure. He did not again go to the sick man, nor turn to look at him, but stood frowning by the door of the hut. When that door was opened, and the prisoners, crowding against one another like a flock of sheep, squeezed into the exit, Pierre pushed his way forward and approached that very captain who, as the corporal had assured him, was ready to do anything for him. The captain was also in marching kit, and on his cold face appeared that same it which Pierre had recognized in the corporal's words and in the roll of the drums. "Pass on," the captain reiterated, frowning sternly and looking at the prisoners who thronged past him. Pierre went up to him, though he knew his attempt would be in vain. "What now?" the officer asked with a cold look, as if not recognizing Pierre. Pierre told him about the sick man. "He'll manage to walk, devil take him," said the captain. Pass on," he continued without looking at Pierre. "But he is dying," Pierre again began. "Be so good," shouted the captain, frowning angrily. Dram-da-da-dam, da-dam, rattled the drums, and Pierre understood that this mysterious force completely controlled these men, and that it was now useless to say any more. The officer prisoners were separated from the soldiers and told to march in front. There were about 30 officers, and Pierre among them, about 300 men. The officers, who had come from the other sheds, were all strangers to Pierre, and much better dressed than he. They looked at him and at his shoes mistrustfully, as at an alien. Not far from him walked a fat major with a sallow, bloated, angry face, who was wearing a Kazan dressing gown tied around a towel, and who evidently enjoyed the respect of his fellow prisoners. He kept one hand, in which he clasped his tobacco pouch, inside the bosom of his dressing gown, and held the stem of his pipe firmly with the other. Panting and puffing, the major grumbled and growled at everybody because he thought he was being pushed, and that they were all hurrying when they had nowhere to hurry to, and were all surprised at something when there was nothing to be surprised at. Another, a thin little officer, was speaking to everyone, conjecturing where they were now being taken and how far they would get that day. An official in felt boots and wearing a commissariat uniform ran round from side to side and gazed at the ruins of Moscow, loudly announcing his observations as to what had been burned down, and what this or that part of the city was that they could see. A third officer, who by his accent was a Pole, disputed with the commissariat officer, arguing that he was mistaken in his identification of the different wards of Moscow. "What are you disputing about?" said the major angrily. "What does it matter whether it's St. Nicholas or St. Blasius? You see it's burned down, and that's the end of it. What are you pushing for? Isn't the road wide enough?" said he, turning to a man behind him who was not pushing him at all. Oh, what have they done?" the prisoners on one side and another were heard saying, as they gazed at the charred ruins. "All beyond the river, the Zubova and the Kremlin, just look. There's not half of it left. Yes, I told you, the whole quarter behind the river. And so it is." "Well, you know it's burned. What's the use of talking?" said the major. As they passed near a church in the Komovniki, one of the few unburned quarters of Moscow, the whole mass of prisoners suddenly started to one side, and exclamations of horror and disgust were heard. "Ah, the villains! What heathens! Yeah, dead, so he is, and smeared with something." Pierre, too, drew near the church where the thing was that evoked these exclamations, and dimly made out something leaning against the paling surrounding the church. From the words of his comrades, who saw better than he did, he found that this was the body of a man, set upright against the palings, with its face smeared with soot. "Go on! What the devil? Go on! 30,000 devils!" The convoy of guards began cursing, and the French soldiers, with fresh virulence, drove away with their swords the crowd of prisoners who were gazing at the dead man. All right, that completes my reading of chapter 288. I will now proceed to my reflection of the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 288. Memento Mori. Levate su in piede, la via il lunga, il cammino il malvagio. These are the words of the poet Virgil, Dante's special escort through the realms of the dead. His admonitory command concludes his tour of hell and heralds the awful ascension of Mount Purgatory. One might assume that hell is where the way is long and the road not easy. There, after all, we find the province of punishment, where the lustful are perpetually swept about by a sinister squall, gluttonous prone shades lay flayed while wallowing in putrefaction, and an unforgivably frozen lake traps the treacherous. That's not the hard part, though. The hard part is the climb up purgatory, where souls are cleansed and made fit for paradise. Likewise, the most difficult part of Pierre Bezukhov's journey is his forced march across wintertime Russia, where he, like the denizens of purgatory, must suffer to earn the reward of spiritual growth. One way to read this chapter is to contrast Pierre's current suffering with his former life of wealth and plenty. Whereas before he lived in freedom among the largest estates in all of Russia, today we find him in captivity sharing a shed with commoners. Formerly, his material wants were all satisfied. Currently, he cannot even secure a decent pair of shoes. Before, he traded witticisms with the sharpest of the Russian intelligentsia. Today, he is subject to the dictates of French officers possessed by a mysterious force that drives men to kill. He can only wait and endure. And this is only the beginning. Greater contrasts with his former life await him on this hard winter's walk. Before he gets started on that terrible journey, however, fate offers Pierre an object of meditation in the form of a dead man the marching prisoners find slumped against the church's palings. That man, his lifeless face now smothered in soot, must once have had a life just like Pierre. He too suffered and rallied, sorrowed and rejoiced. All this, like the earthly deeds of Dante's shades, is now reduced to nothing. Daily meditation. Should prosperity befall thee, rejoice not, and should abasement come upon thee, grieve not. For both shall pass away and be no more. Baha'u'llah, the hidden words. All right, so that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 288 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for joining me today. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation to PayPal. Links to all that are down below. Your support is greatly appreciated. There's also a link down below, links to my Amazon wishlist for books and DVDs. If you decide to get me one of those, we'll set up a Zoom talk so we can talk about those books or those DVDs. And again, your support is greatly appreciated. Tomorrow, we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 289 of War and Peace. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.